Dobrý večer.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Marta, for giving me the stage. I am Zuzana Wienk, and I should lead the discussion with three guests on what's rotten, and we try to be as less depressive as possible. May I invite my guests to come to me, to join me. I will speak English so that we have a smooth discussion. So those of you who need to have headsets, please do so. First, I would like to invite
to the stage Paul Caruana Galizia, my first guest, the son of famous Maltese journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia. And let me welcome also my two guests who will be much more comfortable here on the stage. It's the famous British journalist Misha Glenny, who writes about organized crime and cybercrime, but also made a breakthrough to the film industry recently with his book and adaptation of Mafia. And Sierakowski, who is a very distinguished Polish left-wing liberal intellectual, head of Krytyka Polityczna, who has also departments in Ukraine and Germany, not only Poland, but also a very distinguished author of many outlets, among them the New York Times. Welcome.
Hello.
So we agreed about this, but let me start with a mini interview with Paul, because Paul's story is a personal one. While we have a journalist and an intellectual, you are here not only as an economist and a scientist, but partly because your deep family story that in a very sad way connected Malta to Slovakia. From the Central European perspective, many people see Malta as a beautiful holiday spot, as a peaceful island with good climate. A few people see it as a tax haven, which might be problematic and which might be a place for possible money laundering or tax evasion. And we were, of course, shocked by the death of your mom, a very famous columnist in Malta, investigative journalist who was running an independent blog. But from this perspective, Malta seems like a functioning democracy. Many people would, as Central Europeans, think that democracy is worse off here than in Malta. And yet, it seems that the crime has not been sufficiently investigated, that you are speaking about no hope of finding those ones who ordered it. You needed to flee Malta. You live in London because you don't feel secure, which is a very paradoxical situation, because in Slovakia, with our state of affairs, we would expect Slovak journalists having to flee, not feeling secure here, and we definitely would have no hope that the crime would be investigated properly, and yet, suddenly, whoa. So we need to accommodate, sorry. We would definitely not expect that the murder of Jan Kuciak, a Slovak journalist, would have been investigated properly. So what are we missing? What are we not seeing when we see Malta?
Okay. Well, thank you, and thank you everyone for coming to listen to this. So I think you're right in that you can see Malta as all of those things. So it's, it is a beautiful holiday destination, it is a tax haven, and it is really corrupt. And I think for a long time we were able to get away with it because the changes that were happening in Malta were kind of happening at first quite slowly and gradually, but then they really accelerated. And I think the analogy we had with the first speaker is exactly right, that it's almost like there's been a kidnapping of our institutions and that we're losing democracy from the inside. And what we've seen definitely over the past 5 years when we had a change in government is that systematically the government started kidnapping individual institutions. So it placed very, useful people in the police force, in the judiciary, in every part of the country's institutions that you would really need to control and check corruption, to the point where the only person you had acting as a check on corruption and frankly just totally criminal activity was a journalist. And so when my mother exposed all this corruption, the force of the state wasn't brought down to bear on the corrupt because those institutions were compromised, but on the journalist herself.
But it seems, if it's right, what I read is that the death threats against your mom have been something that your family has been living with for a long, long time. Many of your dogs and pets were killed, that you were threatened quite frequently. So was this dramatic shift really happening in the last 5 years, or do you see the roots much older? And why? Why is it happening? Is it happening because Malta was suddenly discovered as a potential?
It's a good question, and actually the roots are even older. So when Malta, I think, decolonized in 1964, it never properly reformed its institutions, so that the colonial governor's office was effectively replaced by the prime minister's office. So in the same way that we had a colonial governor who would appoint the attorney general, appoint the head of the police force, appoint the judges and magistrates, we now have a prime minister who does that. And for a long time that wasn't, a big problem until we got the wrong kind of prime minister. And that's who we have now. So on the death threats, you're totally right. And in fact, there were 2 arson attacks on our house growing up. The first in the mid-90s, the second when I was at high school. So I was about 17 years old, and there was an arson attack on our house that was so serious, it was in effect the first attempt on my mother's life. So a group of people had laid about 14 2-liter bottles of petrol alongside the back of the house, put loads of car tires alongside them, and set the whole thing alight. So these things happen, and that's part of a kind of bigger structural problem with Malta, that it's extremely bitterly partisan. But the thing is, we always could at least rely on certain institutional checks, and one of the great kind of revealing things about my mother's murder is that it was this kind of final test on Maltese society, and it kind of asked people, do we even have a shared understanding of murder? Do we even have a shared understanding of things like free speech? And a year since she was killed, and I think the answer is no. And we can't even collectively respond in a way that says we need to change our institutions, we need to prosecute the people on whom she was reporting, and we just need to accept that this is a horrible, awful event.
So you don't feel support of the civil society in Malta?
Actually, we do. So one thing that has happened that is really positive is the emergence of new civil society groups. So civil society in Malta has historically been very weak because we have a quite big, state presence. So we've seen more activists speak up and new NGOs emerge, but it's all very kind of young and fragile. What's harder to say is that there's this kind of cross-society consensus on what needs to be done. So, it's been twisted into a partisan fight where some people say, oh, it's just a murder like any other and it has limited implications beyond what happened to this one person. But then there are also people who see it differently and see it for what it is.
But your story is a case of what Misha talks about and writes a lot about, how the world is actually interconnected. And therefore, I really wanted to ask you, do you think that the murder of your mom, the fact that it went so far, because the death threats were known for a long time, your family suffered from it. Is it also a failure of Western democracy on the European Union and the whole state of affairs? Have we been ignorant to these type of matters as an international community for a long time?
So I think, the short answer is yes. The kind of longer answer is that for a long time, so all those years you described, all the death threats, so my mother during that period was reporting on like Maltese level corruption, a corrupt judge, corrupt policemen, corrupt Maltese politicians. Over the past 5 years-ish, I mean, Malta joined, like Slovakia, the European Union in 2004. So starting then, it's almost like Malta's corruption was globalized, and we kind of plugged into this global corruption network. So we had, my mother, a Maltese journalist, effectively working as a freelancer because she broke all her stories on her website. Suddenly up against the Aliyevs in Azerbaijan, or Chinese billionaires and Russian oligarchs, and it just happened. It was almost imperceptible. And not only was my mother alone, but these oligarchs, these actors, suddenly had a way into the European Union via Malta. So that systematic takedown of Maltese institutions allowed all these people into the European Union. And is it a kind of fault of Western democracy? I don't know. So, like a great question, maybe above my pay grade, but I'm sure Misha has an answer.
I will definitely ask the question once again during the panel to both of my guests. One is more optimistic than the other. There will be a good balance. But I wanted to ask you, Paul, just to maybe close this mini interview, like, what does it do to a person when you grow up with constant fear? What was it for you like? How does it shape you? Like, does it shape you to be less perceptive to fear or more perceptive? How do you deal with this?
So the weird and bad thing is that when you grow up with it, when you grow up with the arson attacks, the harassment, the death threats, people shooting and poisoning the dogs, you start normalizing it. And the second arson attack in a weird way didn't feel that unexpected. And in some ways, we all grew up with this sense that someone's going to call and say that something horrible has been done to our mother. And in the end, it happened unbelievably last year. 2017 European Union member state. And I mean, that's the unfortunate thing, that it wasn't just, my family that normalized it, but people got used to seeing my mother targeted, being put up on billboards, being harassed. And that's not good, I think. And you want to, at every one of these events, just take a stand and say this is totally unacceptable. And so maybe the right approach is not to be kind of fearless, brave, and all the rest of it, but to actually really recognize these threats for what they are.
You were unwillingly made part of this story. You could have lived a totally different life, but you never were allowed to have a life of a child. And as I understood, your mom was facing 50 lawsuits. And what was shocking for me is to learn that 34 of them still continue against you.
Yes.
How is this possible?
Well, so under Maltese libel law, which is the same as English libel law, which is really not great libel law, people are allowed to continue seeking damages against a dead person's estate. So if, say, a journalist has written about you and you feel they've libeled you, but they die or are killed, then you are still entitled to damages. So you can go.
These people still continue? They want to ruin you economically?
Including, by the way, the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister and 3 cabinet ministers, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, and various other cronies.
But that's really an economical threat to your family, right?
It is. So another thing that's important to remember about these libel cases is you need to pay to file a defense. So my mother spent a lot of her time over the previous year filing a defense, raising money to defend herself, going up to court to defend herself. And that's what we're doing now. And it's totally abhorrent that it continued afterwards. And so there's one case in particular, which is really something. So a businessman, a major donor to the governing party, sued my mother for libel 19 times for 19 different sentences in the same blog post. And he's still pursuing every single one of them.
I must say Slavek at this point who was very optimistic. Doesn't it shake up your optimism a little bit? You lost, okay.
At least in the European Union.
Yeah, you need to speak on the mic because the translators need to.
Then the question arises, okay, if Malta cannot handle it because Malta is Malta, I don't know exactly what it means, but it is possible. Then if we are a part of the larger organism, if the organism respects itself, or if it is really political, modern, I don't know, you can read a lot of good things about EU, why there is no FBI of EU, why there is no protection, a higher institution that it's supranational. I understand that like EU cannot do nothing, cannot do everything. I mean, there are still nations, I really know all of it and you know all of it, but certain mechanisms just at least to support journalists. There is no millions of journalists, and you don't have, it's not a massive crime against journalism. It happens quite rarely, okay? So why at least, if we cannot have a fiscal union in EU, because Germans doesn't want, Netherlands doesn't want, there are 70 states that should have agreed. But to protect journalists, everybody agrees that we should protect journalists. Then why it happens? I mean...
Well, the first sign of hope is the European prosecutor, which should start with very limited competencies in 2 years, I think, although 4 member states are not joining in, and really the competencies will be very limited. But Paul, what you are describing is, I think, a sickness that we see deeply rooted in a couple of member states. I don't think Malta is the only example. Misha, does this sound familiar? It's a stupid question. It, of course, sounds familiar to you.
Yeah, I mean, Paul, it's very humbling and moving to listen to Paul and his experience. Because it must be so shattering and difficult for him personally, but he is able to understand what the political implications of his experience is, which I think is very important and gives us something to build on. When I started writing McMafia in 2004, 2005, and I was inspired to write it after the assassination of Zoran Đinđić, who was a friend of mine, the Prime Minister of Serbia, because I thought it was time to look at what the connections between dramatic economic transition, in the case of Yugoslavia, armed conflict, new elites, the privatization of previously state assets, and figures from organized crime. I thought it's time to start mapping what all these connections are. And one of the first people who I interviewed was the former head of the Israeli anti-Russian organized crime intelligence unit from Jerusalem, but by now he was posted to Washington and was working in the Washington embassy. And I asked him, because I was at the beginning of this investigation, I said, look, is my life in danger investigating these topics? And he said, it's very unlikely that they will kill you, but if you step on their toes, they will sue you to death. They will keep you tied up in courts for the rest of your life. The real disgrace about the case of Paul's mother is not only was she murdered, which is an absolute outrage, but that her family has to suffer the indignation of these extremely powerful people in Malta still going after them with absolutely no concern for the human experience and loss and bereavement that they have suffered. There are things that we can do about this. So
let's not go this way, because I would like to stay with the diagnosis a little bit longer.
Okay.
But I will ask.
But let me come back to the case of Malta, because there are some very important points in terms of what Slavo's also raised in terms of the European Union. But just generally, I'll do a little sum up of what's happened since McMafia was published in 2007. When I was researching that book, there was no general interest or understanding in the way this phenomenon was globalizing. And it was astonishing to me that people were looking at it, policemen, local journalists, lawyers, victims, and indeed criminals themselves, but hadn't yet fully put together all the threads of how this was becoming a globalized phenomenon. 10 years later, it's 10 years since McMafia was published, there is now a general understanding that we have a culture of political corruption and violence that crosses boundaries, and lots of people are aware of it, to the extent that two of the most powerful offices, political offices in the world, are infected by organized crime, to wit, the presidency of the United States and the presidency of Russia. So you have that extraordinary phenomenon of seeing somebody like Trump in the White House and all of his connections through various mediated institutions with Russian organized crime and Russian intelligence services. But you also have a much more powerful movement which is standing up and saying, we are not going to tolerate this, whether it is NGOs, whether it is police officers and some police forces, whether it's journalists, a whole variety of people who are saying we must insist on transparency, truth, and in both politics and the economy.
You answered many of my questions.
So a big battle is on, is what I'm saying.
Yes,
we are engaged in a big battle.
You know, this brings me to my next question. I wanted to stay a little bit with the diagnosis, because I, on the contrary, don't think people are aware of the details of the problem. But Misha, you described, I think, very accurately what is happening, but do you really think that our problem is not that the world is divided? Because I think that Trump supporters, which is such a vast majority, are totally oblivious to these arguments, and they don't seem to care.
Zuzana, I've spent most of the past 5 years either in the United Kingdom, the United States, or Brazil. And what I see in all three countries is exactly the same. You see an extreme polarization of political discourse, which personally I believe was caused in a very fundamental way by the financial crash of 2008. But what it has done with social media is it has created divides which are the same phenomenon in each country, but which remain very culturally specific. So I don't expect people in Slovakia to understand the insanity of what is going on in my own country at the moment over Brexit. But believe me, it has divided my country in a way I have never seen my country divided before. In the United States, it is very easy to see, because we're bombarded by American media all the time, just how profound that division is.
Yeah, and just to follow up with my question is, when you read on President Trump, I think he's a criminal. I say that with all the seriousness, but I think his supporters don't see him as such. And when you watch Roger Stone, his ideologist, talking to media, he brags about how powerful he is, and he says he doesn't care about what New York Times says. He doesn't care about what respected media outlets say, because his alternative media have far better reach. And so we have created these kind of like parallel universes almost, it seems to me.
Well, what it highlights is a profound identity crisis in all of the countries I've mentioned, and that's replicated elsewhere. It's a reflection partly of what internet technology has done to the mechanism of political discourse. But also there is that element where Trump, somebody like Trump says, you know what, these institutions of that were built in the United States 200 years ago, they're not nearly as sort of resolute and powerful as people imagined. I can say bullshit day after day after day, and it no longer matters. And it's almost like a sudden revelation for people like Trump that the truth is an entirely fungible, malleable concept within the framework of democratic politics. So yes, I mean there is a real problem here, and that division that you talk about. I think that battle that I was talking about is essentially between people who believe that the unequal world that has emerged in the past 30 to 40 years, and it is profoundly unequal in a way that we haven't seen certainly in the modern period in terms of differentials between the rich and the poor, that inequality is supported by a group of wealthy, influential people around the world, and there is another group who say, we are not going to tolerate that, and this is a profound ideological divide.
And just to sum up, what you have been talking about over the 10 years is what Paul has pointed out, the globalization that allowed scaling of organized crime globally and capturing very elite institutions like banks and other financial houses. You say that this business model captures around 15% of global GDP, which is very influential. And you talk about sectors where the organized crime is produced, where it's distributed, and where it's consumed. And you talk about the consumption countries as the US, Britain, being the developed democracies, that seem on the surface that everything is rather fine and we are civilized, but basically they are supporting organized crime and benefiting from it. Like I think that there is a figure that only through the City of London there is like 3 billion pounds laundered every year, which is a shocking number.
Last week, Ben Wallace, the security minister of the British government, stated that 90 billion pounds was laundered through the City of London last year. So this is...
So I was too optimistic.
You were too optimistic. So this is very important. While we had in the 1990s the emergence of gangster capitalism in the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, and the rapid liberalization of markets in countries like China, South Africa, India, and Brazil, What was happening in the West was the soaring victory of financial capitalism over manufacturing capitalism. And that victory of financial capitalism created a flow of money, the like of which the world had never seen before. And so it was London and New York, as they competed to become the financial capital of the world, that acted as handmaiden to the ill-gotten gains of people, whether it was American corporates like Enron evading tax, whether it was Chinese gambling consortia, whether it was the Mexican drug cartels laundering money through HSBC, whether it was Abramovich buying up Chelsea or whatever. We became the facilitators for this new system of oligarchic and criminal corruption, and
do you think British people, Americans, recognize it? Do they feel that they are part of the problem?
They do in Britain after McMafia was turned into a TV show, but until then, it was. It's very difficult to see because you don't. It's not visible around you.
Whereas you say that they are under the radar, although they might be your neighbors in London, right? Because they like luxurious lifestyle.
They do. They like living in London. Great theatre, great restaurants.
They are cultured, probably good.
Theatre's very good, Slava. We'll have an argument about that later, but I'm a big supporter of British theatre at the moment. But
so what's the problem in your eyes? What is rotten fundamentally? Is it the economical model? Is it are we dependent in the Western world on these profits?
It's all interconnected. We're not dependent, but you certainly develop an addiction from these profits. But this is a complex system, and you have to look at each country. Each country is responsible for a different part of the puzzle. So, for example, Malta, which I do want to come back to, the Maltese practice of handing passports, of selling passports to anyone in the world, which gives them access to the European Union, is an absolute outrage, and it's something that the EU, for security purposes, if nothing else, should say to the Maltese government, you cannot do this.
Is it still happening, Paul?
It's still happening in a big way. It's a major, so the trouble is, like Misha was just saying, it's easy money. So when we joined the European Union, these passports became a valuable commodity, and so you get all this money coming in. There are obviously no real checks, like you were saying, on who buys them, but it's generated this whole economy of facilitators. So you have the agents who sell passports, you have all the lawyers who sort of lawyer the whole deal up, you have the accountants. You also have real estate agents, because to buy a passport, you need to buy some property now, which is meant to satisfy absurdly a residency requirement, but it's just inflating the property market. And you obviously have the government itself, which earns a lot of revenue from every passport sold. So you have very little opposition to it, weirdly.
Does a voting right come with that?
The voting rights do come with
really?
it.
Okay,
yes.
That's even more dangerous. So the Maltese population can transform completely in
so you are a totally complete citizen. It's not just residency, it's complete citizenship.
And EU hasn't responded to this after the death of your mom at all?
I know there's more pressure now, but look, to be completely fair, so the European Parliament finds it completely unacceptable, and when the deal was first announced, voted almost completely to ban it, this idea that you can sell European Union passports. But the European Commission said, look, we can't really do this, it's outside our area of competence, or whatever they say, and said we can at least kind of demand that they put certain conditions, which is where the property purchase requirement comes from.
If I might include you, Slavek, so sorry to keep you out for such a long time.
I'm very interested how.
What Misha and Paul are describing, it seems that the root of or the causes of these problems are purely economical. But when you look at Poland, many people describe the cause of the problem that Poland has politically at the moment are ideological. Is it so? or is there a strong economical element as well?
I got used to rather criticizing Poland for Kaczynski for obvious reasons, and trying to explain what is going on and not simplifying it by asking, like a little bit you're doing, Zuzana, why people vote for Trump. That do they not see that the Trump is idiot, murderer, not murderer,
No, they
but
don't see it.
bandit. No, it's more. Truth is a more complex phenomenon than like Aristotelian yes or no. Actually, Aristoteles was already right, saying that it's an adequacy between the words and the reality, and this adequacy has. It's multidimensional. If there is no security, there is no trust to what is true, what is not. If the security is not economic, if there is no social minimum, then people doesn't have a good interest in believing the truth, or they don't feel connection to the truth producers like media, etc. This is actually. I think it's better and more healthy intellectually and more safe politically to find or to search for what is rational in voting for Trump or rational for voting for Kaczynski. Then I think it's a better way to understand the social processes
I
that are
totally agree.
behind it.
And what is then rational in voting for Kaczynski? What would you say? What's your answer?
First, let me do the exit from the discussion in a sense that I'm not a specialist like Misha. I don't have my experience as well. And Poland, fortunately, is probably the least corrupted country, at least in the region. And this is actually quite an interesting phenomenon. And by coincidence, I had a conversation with Jacques Rupnik, who was a guest here actually 2 years ago. We were on the same stage in Paris. Yesterday, he was asking me about, we were talking about Orban. And of course, when you say Orban, the second word is oligarch. And then he thought, actually like Natalia also, thought that it's obvious that probably Poland has the same problem. And of course, like I would think the same way. Like if oligarchs are everywhere in the region, probably they exist in Poland. Yes, they exist in a sense that you have rich people not necessarily very honestly accumulate, or not probably very clearly and transparently accumulated their wealth in 90s, but there are very different, there are very clear and serious differences. First, our privatization was very different than in other countries. People who have money usually are quite detached from politics. I wouldn't know. I mean, I have no idea how they vote for. They are not connected to political parties. They try not to show themselves, and probably even try not to be too friendly to politicians. Or politicians actually, and people like Kaczynski. In your question is already the answer, are so ideologized, and my country is so ideologized that money is just not the strongest incentive. So Kaczynski doesn't have a bank account. He doesn't have a driving license. He doesn't have a woman or a man. He doesn't have anything. He has a cat. Really, he has a cat, and the second fact that we know, because he confessed it, is that he watches rodeo in the night in TV. This is the only sport he knows, rodeo. And so.
But I'm trying to. I totally agree with you that we shouldn't simplify, and we should definitely try to see what's the rational point of people who are.
I'll answer this question
but
if you let me.
Yeah, yes, but if I can just add to the question, like it seems that the democracy is challenged in unprecedented levels around the world. And in some areas, as we heard, the root is economical, or the cause, the driver is purely economical. You described Kaczynski, who only has a cat. That's probably purely ideological, but he still disrupts institutions. And, Misha and Paul talked about how quickly that can happen and how we are watching with awe happen in places that we would never expect that to happen, like the US, for example, or Britain. And in Poland, with the judicial so-called reform, you have grand challenges as well. And I'm trying to find a common thread. What do you think? Or I'm trying to bring the debate together, if it's possible. Maybe you tell me that that I'm wrong. But is there the common cause? Is it a problem with our economical model we are facing that is feeding all these type of politicians who are either finding economical ways or ideological ways to disrupt our institutions that we relied on? Or what is it? What do you think? Is it anti-elitist movement or a wave?
Either I don't understand the question, or the answer is just no. I mean,
okay, so try to elaborate, and then I'll ask further.
Everything connects with everything, and everything has something in common with everything. So probably populists have something in common everywhere. But to give you certain interesting difference is that and Misha mentioned it, when everybody are sure and convinced that the theory about populism, that the construction of this theory is quite clear, neoliberalism or financial capitalism, rapid liberalization, etc., created such a huge inequalities and social pauperization and the critical mass of angry people that it fueled populist parties. Yes? No. Not in my region. Poland, in Poland's civic platform, ruling for 8 years, lost power, having the best economic results in entire Europe. And you can claim that maybe inequalities increased. No, they did not increase. They decreased actually, and they lost. They lost president post. They lost in parliament. They lost social trust. They went down. We even found out during the sociological research that people who support still civic platform, it's second in the public polls, share the same bad image of civic platform as people who oppose civic platform. They find civic platform is the most corrupted party in Poland, where the truth is exactly the opposite.
And what happened in what happened, if I just may add,
Okay.
there was a column in The Economist who said exactly what you are saying, and added that people, Poland seen economical growth, a steady economical growth, a success. So they echoed what you are saying, and they added that the dissatisfaction came from people who want to do better and want it now. That was the conclusion. Would you challenge that?
Of course, always this is this Tocqueville law that aspirations grow higher when the situation improves. And of course, it's partial answer. You can also add that that the economic success was mostly technical, infrastructural. We have new highways, stadiums, etc. But there was no, people didn't see it in their pockets. When Kaczynski came, he launched the largest social transfers in Polish history, in the same time proving that his conspiracy theory was right. Well, elites had money, they didn't want it to give you, I came, I give you, the Poland still has booming. So...
Can I add something here, Slavek? That's quite, because you've hit something that is very important. Now, I said, and you were slightly skeptical of it, I talked about, yeah, exactly, no, but so inequality in 2008, the financial crash, clearly has a huge impact on one level. But this issue of identity and uncertainty is really, really important, and it is linked to specific cultural conditions. So, if we take, for me, the most important statistic about the Brexit debate in the United Kingdom is you have two cities, one in the north of England called Wigan, in the northwest of England, and one near Glasgow in Scotland called Paisley. They both have the same number of inhabitants, over 100,000. They have an identical economic history of industrialization and then industrial collapse and then a reinvention. They're only about 120 miles and 200 kilometers apart from each other. Wigan voted 70% to leave the European Union. Paisley in Scotland voted 70% to remain in the European Union. And the reason for this is the very specific identity differences between an English city at a time when the United Kingdom and English identity is collapsing, and a Scottish city where you have a surge and a relationship between that population and the Scottish Parliament. So there's a decentralization thing which works in favor of the European Union there. Now, those are very specific things where you see the same economic processes, the same processes of inequality, but you have a completely different outcome. And it comes down to this very complex policy, as Slavek was saying, about the interaction of why is it rational for people to vote in a certain way. And there are lots of people who vote for Trump who have, from their perspective, very good reasons to do so, and that's what we have to do is to understand why that is happening.
Exactly.
Can you tell me why? What is your why?
Okay. Because we saw this discrepancy, and we also started to see new, totally paradoxical phenomenon. When Kaczynski came to power, he started one war after another with everybody: Brussels, Germany, judiciaries, media, doctors, lawyers, like everybody, and then changing law in a compromising way, doing things that were unbelievable. One out of these 10 things would kill any other party immediately, and public polls were growing, okay, for Kaczynski, or at least there was no damage in for his party at all, no bad consequences. Why? So we decided that we will send sociologists to the city where Kaczynski has support 10% higher than in the public, in elections, and we just did most simple quality sociological research. First, we interviewed people to distinguish, to select people from middle class, popular class, according to the typical sociological criteria based on profession, education, etc. And then we discussed with them the main topics of public debate: abortion, constitutional court, etc., etc. And we found out that, first of all, the city where people voted for Kaczynski in a massive way is not the dying shithole, but flourishing, well-organized city when happy people are walking in the streets with the young babies, restaurants, new buildings are emerging. Of course, and the unemployment is really is below the average actually, and unemployment now in Poland is third smallest in EU, which it's shocking to me still, because I get used to the 20% unemployment in Poland. Now it's like 4 or 5 maybe, which means that there is no unemployment. Then we started to talk to people, and we see that for Kaczynski vote people, it's rather regular, it's almost a standard, people who find themselves successful in their lives, happy, modern, Western oriented, okay?
Why? Why?
Why? Because for them, Kaczynski is modern, Western, active politician who finally changed the state to act for the people, with the people, and engaging people. For them, the campaigns that he organized, for us are hate campaigns, for them are campaigns for something. When politicians before were saying, like Tusk, you have a vision in politics, go to the doctor. Okay, we will not promise too much. We will be minimalist. Okay, we are not interested in ground reforms. Ground reforms socialists did. Okay, before, and you see what happened. And also they were promising different things, but then when they took over power, they were saying, well, maybe this is not possible, this maybe later. Well, we will do something, but we don't know how we will find money for it. And then Kaczynski came and not only did what he said that he's going to do, but he did 10 times more, and also like started many more campaigns. So what was, and this is the answer, for it was not economic reasons, it was not even refugees, because we don't have in Poland refugees. It was more post-politics that people were rather angry or disappointed with. This kind of like detached state that is detached from them, from their interests, doesn't give also any definition of situation. For a popular class, differently than for the middle class, when Kaczynski was just, like in France, they have a child care system that Kaczynski started, like in Germany. Finally, we joined EU. Remember, 80s, let me choose this question that I will finish, this answer, yes, okay? Yes. 88% of Poles vote are like EU and support the idea of European accession, okay? This is why for them, and there is no cognitive dissonance for them to support Kaczynski and support EU in the same time, because Kaczynski for them is one of European leaders, okay? So the answer why popular class supported Kaczynski is that he's the first that defined the community in a stupid way for us, paranoid way, with the stupid mythologized version of Polish history. But, you know, this is better than nothing for them, okay? And with this we have to challenge, and this is the problem.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So what you describe reminds me of a question that has been brought up a couple of times during this debate, is this divide. And when I read Jonathan Haidt, The Righteous Mind, that he was trying to investigate the grounds of morality in people, he found out that there are like two parallel universes between the conservatively leaning people and liberal leaning people, leaning to completely different sets of values that don't seem to be compatible and don't seem to be speaking the same language. The other thing that I found very interesting is the global barometer of trust that has been measured over the past 50 years was pointing out 2 years ago for the first time that the coherence in societies is collapsing, that we are really facing unprecedented levels of disharmony. And you describe two parallel universes as well, in other words, not economical, but two parallel universes. So how do we bring the societies together? Misha, do you have an answer to that?
In short, no, I don't. I think it's going to take a very long time. I don't think that these things are ever finally resolved anyhow. But I do think that we are reaching a very significant point in global history because of the fact there is one overwhelming issue that is going to affect all of us, whatever our opinions, and that is climate change, global warming. And one of the reasons why I'm deeply concerned at the moment with the election of Jair Bolsonaro as president of Brazil is the fact that he is going to start cutting down the Amazon. And that's not just a Brazilian issue, that's a global issue. So I say that we have, in the next 5 to 10 years, very concrete challenges which are to do not just with social or economic issues ourselves, but it's about ultimately what is going to happen to the species as a whole.
And you said in your previous remarks that you feel that we at least recognize the problem. When you wrote the book 10 years ago, you didn't feel that there was a recognition of the problem. So, you know, this touched me as an anti-corruption activist, and I was mentioning it to you previously, that I had the feeling that we were doing the right thing from the point of civil society. We were trying to bring proper and correct information to the people about the depth of corruption and state capture in this region, and not realizing that we are also feeding with our narrative the extremists who used it and misused the arguments to fight the establishment and came with an alternative proposition to people. And Slavek, you mentioned this disappointment as well. So, Misha, do you feel frustrated a little bit as well about the fact that we recognize the problem but we are not able to turn the ship around? Or do you feel that we are at least in the state globally that we are already finding the remedies? You know, there is much more debate on the registers of beneficial ownership, the recognition that now the financial markets and international financial markets are feeding the corruption.
Well, I'm on the full disclosure International Advisory Board of Global Witness, an NGO which works with anti-corruption, human rights abuses, and mineral resource extraction around the world. And when I see organizations like that affect real changes in policy level, and they're working on the Maltese passport issue at the moment, which is why one of the reasons why I'm quite engaged by what Paul has to say, is I think, yes, actually there are things that you can do which have a significant impact. And we have finally got legislation through in the United Kingdom for the first time, which will forbid anonymous companies from investing in British property. And this is a really, really big shift in the way that we do things. So it's, you know, it's small steps, but accumulated, they can make a difference. But it requires a lot of people to remain working very hard and being very engaged with these issues. I'm not wildly optimistic, but I think it's in human nature that until everything goes up in smoke, we will continue trying to do something about it.
I still haven't close the debate, but I feel that we owe you a space to ask questions as well, because we have last 10 minutes of the debate, and I wouldn't feel well if we just kept it on the stage, although we can't see well. Prosím vás, máte vy nejaké otázky? Nech sa páči a poprosím vás na mikrofón.
So if any of the audience has a question, please indicate it, and you need a microphone, and the guests will need, so those who do not understand Slovak will have to use anyway the headsets, and English is on channel 6. And probably I have to come to you with a mic.
A viete čo, asi mi ho aj rovno doneste, že ja tu na ňo počkam. Nám bude chýbať.
No, tak to...
Ja to preložím. Ja to asi preložím.
No, teda chorá justícia je veľmi vážna vec.
Sick justice is a very serious thing. If the justice is sick, then the state will get sick, and probably the whole Europe, and will fall apart. Is this something the leaders of the EU understand this problem, and are they ready and able to help the sick countries? The countries who are sick of corruption and sick of corrupted justice.
Sick justice, and if you think that European Union is willing to help member states to recover from this sickness and weakness of justices, judicial institutions. I don't know if you want to.
I can have a very general answer, but maybe there is something important to tell you here, or just to express maybe. With populists, we have to win politically, because law, truth, etc., they don't defend themselves only by the fact that they are true, legal, and so on. So we cannot count that EU will come and do something. Only people who will support us. I mean, EU can be helpful only if it helps win politically. Okay, so to give you an example, now we have a huge polarization in Poland, which unfortunately works very. It's kind of a blockade to development, because if the only stake in politics is to fight with Trump or Kaczynski to defend country so it will not be destroyed by barbarians, it's a politics that it's not focused on any development. So third possibilities in Polish politics are that they just cannot, they doesn't fit to the main argument. Someone wants to start a party, shift Polish politics more into progressive way, and because the only fact that he doesn't belong to this Kaczysm versus anti-Kaczysm cannot emerge. So unfortunately, this polarization, just look at this from this perspective, is also a blockade. But once we have it, and the next, what we will have will be Euro election. I think that the opposition will win this election, because what is different from Hungarian situation, Kaczynski never has support of more than 40% of people, never had, whereas Fidesz had almost 70%, and sometimes even 70% in public polls. An election can have majority. In 2010, he got 54%. Unbelievable in Poland with Kaczynski, who is still and always was most hated politician. And so he personally is unelectable. This is why you have Szydło, Morawiecki and other avatars of Kaczynski.
I'm sorry, I have to cut you down because we have...
So I'm just saying that count on EU when it helps to win with populists, but don't count that it will solve your problem.
Slava, can you pass the mic to Paul, please? You wanted to respond, right?
So
Thank you.
I'm really sorry, I didn't hear it on my it was about justice.
It was about justice. The respondent felt that that judiciaries around Europe are compromised and sick,
yes.
and he felt that EU. He was asking if EU is doing enough to help member states to overcome it.
So I actually think the EU can and should do a lot more than it is doing, and I think there is a kind of political rationale for it. So Misha mentioned the kind of security risks associated with Maltese passport sales, and that's right, and that has to provide an argument for the European Union, or the European Commission at least, to actually do something at a national level. It provides a way in. And I find it funny that we're so easy talking about economic, financial integration and whatever, and we have these completely dysfunctional judiciaries in different member states, which are in effect really weak links. You know, there's no point in having perfect anti-money laundering directives, and then you have one country in which one judiciary doesn't enforce or prosecute under that directive. It's a complete farce. And we should demand more of the European Union. I think we should demand more of it every single day in every respect.
I think what is telling is that the last anti-money laundering directive faced such problems in transposition that EU had to bring, I think, 18 or 20 infringement procedures. But I want to give more space to at least two questions. I need to borrow the mic again. My si zoberieme obidve tie otázky, páči sa.
Hi, I will speak in English. You're talking about everything, it's so depressive because it's also, I cannot really grasp on the EU, but I still want to know what can we do against it. I simply refuse to go with this populist, anti-populist movement just to be labeled slniečkári, or I think when we speak about things like this, we polarize it and we support this narrative. So I really disagree with this. First thing, I'm posing myself a question, I'm urbanist. What can we do against these big oligarchs like Babiš or whatever who are, building up this momentum, even Fico? Big money, a lot of resources, but I seem to see this pattern. It's local initiatives which are taking success. Valo is one of the products, but Prague 7 local initiatives is now on the city level. Also, we have cities in Poland where mayors are long-term and they cannot be beaten by all these populists or even Kaczynski because they have nothing like this. It's Gdańsk, Wrocław. So we are completely skipping the level of the city. And the city is where we spend our lives and where we can do a lot. So I would like to maybe grasp on what do you think we can do in our cities to actually do something good for our state or even EU?
Ďakujem veľmi pekne. Thank you. So the question is the answer more activism, more civic activism and local, more connected to the city? Local governance, stronger local governance?
Look, we haven't really talked much about Jan Kuciak here this evening, but one of the things which has struck me, I'm back in Slovakia for the first time in 25 years, but I read the Slovak press and I've been following roughly what's been happening in this country over the past quarter of a century. And what has struck me in the past 24 hours is how Kuciak's murder has actually galvanized people in a way that we haven't seen in other Central European countries. And this is very positive. You mentioned Valo, who's been elected as Bratislava's mayor at the weekend. And I think this is a sign that it's transferring into actual politics. It's not just about people being out on the street. I would say two things. That first of all, I stress again that each of us has our own work to do in those areas where we happen to be competent and where we can contribute. But your point about cities is very well taken and very important. And if we look at the United States, the opposition to Trump's policies, not his rhetoric, but his policies, we see in New York, we see in Sacramento, in California, in Los Angeles, we see in cities all over the United States, and similarly in the United Kingdom, the places where we have the most integration, the most economic success, and coincidentally, the strongest pro-EU feeling are the bigger cities. We are seeing mayors from different countries, from major cities, come together and create joint initiatives, particularly on things like climate change, but also on rational transport policies and so on. They're interlinked, obviously. And so this is a very encouraging movement. And the reason why it happens is because mayors have to respond much more directly to the demands and the requirements of their citizens in a way that you don't have to do so much on national politics. So I think it is a way
This speaks to Slovak's optimism, right?
Yeah, I had no chance to be too optimistic, but we just won local elections in Poland,
Yes,
and so I have one reservation to actually what you said. I don't know if you will analyze your question. There was certain discrepancy in it, because first you said that you don't like polarization, and then you mentioned cities. And then Misha said that there is very positive phenomenon in cities. The problem is that the real polarization is growing between cities and the province. And in local elections, you know in how many cities Kaczynski people won? Out of 107, in 6. The rest go to opposition. But it's a good message, but on the other hand, there are islands of freedom, modernization, all those good things. But what about the rest? And this polarization is growing. And in Poland, in villages, still lives 30% of people. So to deal with this, it's one of the challenges that we have to take.
Thank you very much. That's the same. We had the same story in Slovakia with our local recent elections, that the big cities went to more progressive politicians and the divide was in the countryside. A poslednú otázku vás poprosím, myslím, že už viac nebudeme mať čas. Nech sa páči.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask about the topic of climate change and global warming. So why do you think that people such as the Brazilian president and Trump are still being elected, although I believe that the majority of people have the awareness about the causes of global warming and climate change, and
there's a simple answer to that, is people don't go to the polls and vote on what climate change policy is, pure and simple. It's worth remembering that Trump lost the popular vote by 3 million votes. It's not what is immediately in people's minds. They're worried about corruption, they're worried about, in Brazil, it's to do with personal security and violence and things like that. It's a whole cocktail of things. And whilst people may feel good or bad on a sort of emotive, distant level about climate change, they're much more concerned about how their child is doing at school or whether the local hospital is closed or open.
I'm really sorry, we just ran out of time, but it would be too foolish to expect that we solve these problems tonight over more than an hour. But I would like to ask you, Paul, coming back, close the loop. Thank you so much for coming and sharing the story, and we really wish you good luck and cross our fingers. What would be good ending for you, if this question doesn't sound too absurd? Because you, as I said, you were basically forced into the story of your mom and you carry it forward. It affects your life. What would be a good ending, a way out of these troubles for you? If I could ask for the mic.
Thank you. Well, a good question. I think that it's sort of justice, but broadly conceived. So it's not just justice in my mother's case as an individual human being and finding out who detonated the bomb, who ordered the detonation of that bomb, but it's justice for every single piece of her writing. So it's justice for the people on whom she reported and exposed to have been really seriously corrupt and criminal figures. I think also that Malta has this kind of window of opportunity that we're really in danger of missing. So we collectively got to this point where my mother was blown up in broad daylight, a Monday afternoon right outside our house, and we could collectively say, this is really our lowest point in our post-independence history, maybe in our history. And we could seize it and say we need to start doing something about our institutions, we need to demand more of our politicians, and we can take that opportunity, but I worry that we're very close to missing it.
We talked about hugely divided worlds. We talked about the split among cities and countryside, about a lot of positive things that are happening, about recognition that is much grander than 10 years ago of the problems that exist, and how we try to turn the ship around. Do you have hope?
I think so. I mean, you've got to have hope, because otherwise I'm not sure how to get up every day. But I think there is a rational basis for it. I think if I mean, who was really writing about the offshore world in 2004 besides Misha? And now, and look at us now, and look at the Panama Papers, look at all the prosecutions around them, look at the way people talk about these issues, look at the work that organizations like Global Witness and Transparency are doing. And it's significant and it's important, but there are major weak points in the world, and Malta is one of them. And that's no that's more reason to kind of become more forceful rather than sort of think of the ship as just carrying on. I think the ship is turning.
Thank you so much for the hope. It's very valuable that it comes from your side. Good luck, and thank you also to my distinguished guests, Sławek Sierakowski and Misha Glenny.